Hello, good morning. You're watching Core Finance. I'm Charlie Gibson, and as we all know, with resources companies, one of the key things is your postcode. And one of the companies that seems to be in the right postcode, and in this case the postcode is offshore Cameroon, is Tower Resources, and I'm joined today by its chairman and its chief executive officer, Jeremy Asher. Jeremy, very good morning to you. Thank you very much indeed for joining us. Tower Resources, offshore Cameroon, you seem to be in the right place at, I suppose, roughly the right time. Just tell us where you are in terms of you had a reserve statement out relatively recently, but in terms of the projection of the company or the evolution of the company from an explorer to being a producer, where are you?
Well, we're quite a long way down that road now, and it's been a long road. We signed this license in Cameroon in 2015, but we'd actually spent nearly 2 years prior to that point in negotiations over it, having participated in the license round. And where we are now is the result of more than 3 years of hard work on the license. We're now planning to drill what will be the third well on the Contingency structure in the southern part of the license, which is where Total had drilled 2 discovery wells about a decade ago, but then left them. What we've been doing over the last 2 or 3 years has been getting a better understanding of what Total actually found, with the benefit of reprocessing the existing seismic data and also doing some additional analysis, fault seal analysis and so forth, which has led us to the reserves report. But that's also led us to a plan for moving forward, starting with the well in April. And the well in April is aimed at getting a sense of how the reservoirs, which Total already discovered, how they'll flow. Because although Total drilled these wells and they did the usual testing while drilling, they didn't actually do a flow-to-surface drill stem test after they'd finished the wells. And so we don't yet have a really good estimate of the rate at which the individual reservoirs and the wells are going to flow, which we'd like to have before we commit to production equipment down there. Our plan, once we've drilled this well, and assuming things go as we hope, is that we'll then move as quickly as we can with both the government in terms of permitting and with contractors in terms of getting equipment mobilized to bring a mobile oil production unit to the site, and then we'll both put the first well, this third well that we've drilled, into production and drill 3 more wells from the same location but deviated into different parts of the reservoir to expand the production from the reservoirs that we've already identified. And with one of those wells we'll also go deeper into reservoirs that Total never reached, to see what additional resources we can convert to reserves. Now, with 18 million barrels of contingent resources already identified, that's already a lot of reserves that we should establish the moment we drill the first well and have the flow test results. But there's another 20 million barrels or more of prospective resources which we'll expect to test with those 3 wells that will follow. So potentially we could have as much as 8,000 barrels a day or more of production within 12 to 18 months, and that will be transforming for us, and that will only be the beginning of what we plan to do in Cameroon.
So if I were to summarise, you think Total made a Horlicks of the whole thing?
Oh, well, not for Total, because while this is a very significant thing for us, it's simply not that big for a Total. It doesn't move the needle for a super major. That was why, although they didn't particularly want to stop what they were doing, they were in no hurry to push it forward, and in this business you can't sit on licenses forever. So at a certain point they had to gracefully relinquish the license. Now, at that point, they'd also made discoveries in the northern part of the license, which Perenco acquired and converted into the Dasoni field. That's turned out to be a very nice asset for them. one of their lower cost assets, I believe, and are very profitable because they're producing. They certainly peak production was around 12,500 barrels a day, and we hope now to do something similar with the Njomji structure in the remaining part of the license that we have now. But we also have additional prospects in the north, up close to where Perenco has the Disoni field. And as soon as we're into the testing program on the wells that we plan to drill in Njomji, we will also, I hope, be able to do some further exploration of those prospects in the northern part. It's a very interesting area, Cameroon, because it's been well explored up to a point in the shallow areas, but there's still discoveries being made even in the shallow areas, such as the Oak discovery that Glencore made about 5-6 years ago, and what we're doing here in Njomji. But the deeper areas are relatively underexplored, and we haven't neglected those either in the work we've done to date, but we're focusing on the resources that we can see in the shallow areas first. We're not going to ignore the deeper potential as we continue with the exploration of the block.
So to summarise, you've obviously got the ground, you've shot some seismic, you've got some reserves, you want to do a flow test, and assuming that is successful, you want to bring it into production. Is that a fair summary?
Well, we didn't acquire this seismic. There's 5 different seismic surveys that we merged and reprocessed. We probably will acquire fresh seismic as well to get a better picture of the deeper zones in the future. But for now, what we've already got has been very helpful and has given us a completely different view of the shallow areas already. So that's how we've gotten to where we are now. Looking forward, we have resources, contingent resources, which we expect to become reserves after this first well, and then we'll go on from there. Hopefully, with the subsequent wells into the deeper reservoirs, we'll take what are now prospective resources and also promote those to reserves too. And they'll go directly from one to the other because the wells that will test those will also be capable of producing from them.
When you said contingent reserves, what are they contingent on?
Well, with the way reserves are categorized, proven reserves are usually either under development or capable of being put into production or already in production. Contingent resources also fall into different categories, and usually the development is contingent upon something, and it can be a small something or it can be a big something. Sometimes the whole development can be on hold or it can even be doubtful. In our case, the contingency is nobody's flow tested these wells, the previous 2 wells. So we need to know that the wells will flow at the expected rates, and we also need a good sense of what the initial flow rate is for sizing the equipment that we want to bring, not just to test on an extended basis this first well, but also the 3 other wells we need to drill. So to size that equipment correctly and to be well prepared for what we plan to do next, we need to have a proper drill stem test from this first well that we're drilling now.
So your resources are contingent. Are your reserves contingent as well, or are they reserves?
Well, resources are a category of reserves. Mm-hmm. So generally, reserves are either literally reserves, they're called reserves, but resources are also reserves. They're different kind. Your contingent resources will become reserves contingent on certain things.
Right.
And then
but your reserves are
yes,
reserves.
And then you have your prospective resources. Well, our reserve report has contingent resources and it has prospective resources. So we have 18 million barrels of contingent resources, which should become reserves after a successful flow test of the April well. And we also have some 20 million barrels of prospective resources on the Njomji structure and a lot more in the other prospects. When we drill the second series of wells on the Njomji structure, if we're successful with those, then they will also convert those prospective resources directly into reserves.
All of this, what you have to do, it sounds like it amounts to money.
Yes.
So you need investment. Are you fully funded to the end of the flow tests that you want to do? Where are you in terms of funding your ambitions?
Well, what we need to do at the moment is drill this first well. Now, we have interest from industry in partnering to do that, but I'm not sure that that strategically is exactly the best way forward for us. We also have some debt capacity now that we have contingent resources. Now, the amount of debt capacity we'll have after we've drilled this first well will increase dramatically, because then we'll have reserves which are easier to finance at a higher percentage of value. But even now, the contingent resources we have are significant, and the expected monetary value of those contingent resources is estimated at $118 million. So we've got some significant collateral, and we're working right now on debt options, as well as, of course, we always have the option to issue shares to raise equity. In practice, I think all three routes are viable, and it's a matter for us of choosing what's going to deliver the best result for shareholders. But since we as directors are also significant shareholders ourselves, we're definitely motivated to do what's best for all shareholders and not to dilute unnecessarily. So, as I say, we're looking at a combination of the options, and we'll choose what seems to give the best result for shareholders.
I assume that you would be looking at a contractor to drill this first well?
Well, not really. We have retained Bedrock Drilling, which is led by Phil Church, to supervise the well, provide the well management. Bedrock drilled the last two Atinde wells for New Age, Lukoil, and Belgravia. So they're very experienced, not only around the world, but specifically in Cameroon and recently. So they know exactly what equipment is where and so forth, which is very helpful when you're sort of planning a well. We've already signed a letter of commitment for a rig, and we expect to have that contract finalized within the next 30 days or less. We've already started on long lead items, and we've been working for months on the specification of services to go on the rig. So we're well underway, and we're planning for a spud in April. We don't need any help in drilling the well. I think that we've got quite a lot of depth in the organisation to deal with that. We've had a long-standing relationship with EPI over the last 5 years, who have been with us all through the journey in Cameroon. EPI provide G&G capability, and because they're a larger company, but we have an exclusive partnership with them in Cameroon, we have access to all the skill set that they have whenever we need it, all the software and so forth. So we can very much punch above our weight in technical terms. And again, Bedrock, know exactly what they're doing with the wells in Cameroon. So we feel definitely that we're ready to go.
I know sometimes with oil companies and with permits in particular, you have to hit certain milestones by certain points in time. It's a sort of government ministerial requirement rather than anything else. But are any of those milestones looming for you?
Well, we have until the September of 2019 to get the well drilled. We promised the ministry that we would have our rig contract signed by December 15th, and I'm sure we will. Those are the two immediate deadlines, and once we've drilled the well, we'll move as quickly as we can, both to get a fresh updated reserve report based on the flow test, but also to work with the government to nail down the plans that we have for the extended well test and the further drilling, and finding the appropriate legal frameworks for those things, and getting the appropriate approvals done. One of the things that we'll have to deal with is that specific equipment needs to be approved before you can use it, so we'll have to have specified the equipment and then got the approval for that. So there's a lot to be done, but there's no reason why we shouldn't get it done in the timeframes that we have available.
So in your wildest dreams, or possibly not in your wildest dreams, but best case scenario, when would you enter production, do you think?
Best case, we'd have production before the end of 2019. And that could fall. We could slide into 2020. But in any event, I expect that we will actually have oil production and revenues at some point in 2020. And that will make a huge difference to us as a company. But, you know, we don't stop there. Once we've got that initial production in place, we'll still be doing that through an extended well test, which will be telling us quite a lot more about the Njonji structure. But at the same time, we'll also be planning more exploration wells in the block, but also in the prospects in the northern part of the block. And when we do drill those additional exploration wells, we'll also put at least one of them into some of the deeper zones, which we're all very curious about.
You said, I think, you'd done a fault seal test on Njonji. Can you tell us what that showed? Because that's a fairly important test.
Well, the interesting thing, in some cases it wouldn't have made any difference, and it's not something you'd necessarily do. In the case of the Njonji structure, it was clear that there were more than one fault block. And this was something that Total had found at the very beginning. When they drilled the first two wells, they weren't sure whether the two wells would be accessing the same reservoir or a different reservoir, because there was quite a prominent fault-like thing between the two wells. And they figured out immediately after drilling the second well that that was indeed a sealing fault that was separating one part of the structure from the other. There were other faults which appeared on the seismic, but it wasn't clear whether they were sealing or not, whether they were simply baffles, and at which levels, because you've got different reservoirs at different levels. So one of the things that we sought to do with reprocessing the seismic, and then with the subsequent analysis we did, was to get a picture both of the overall structure and the thickness of the reservoirs and how that changed over the structure, but also to try to get a better picture of those seals and to figure out which were sealing at which level and which were not. In the end, to be sure, we sent the data off to Dr. Needham at Leeds University, who's one of the UK's top experts on fault seal analysis, for him to look at it. And in fact, what we were hoping was that this east-west fault would not be sealing on the main reservoir, but he didn't know that. And in fact, he was rather assuming that we were hoping it was a sealing fault, right, in order to keep the oil in, which made it particularly useful to have his opinion, because he didn't know what we wanted to hear. Mm-hmm. And he came back very apologetically saying that it was almost surely not a sealing fault, and couldn't understand why we were so happy about that. But it was excellent news, because it means that the likelihood is that there's a substantial amount more volume than in that particular fault block than Total had originally suspected. Now, the fact that the reservoir is one continuous reservoir doesn't necessarily mean there's that much more oil there, because had it been sealing, but there'd been oil on both sides, you'd still have oil in the reservoir. but the connected reservoir is much easier to manage and to develop than if you have the separate fault blocks to manage in terms of reservoir management.
So tell us a little bit about because we think of West Africa and oil, and I think most people, certainly if they're not an expert in the field, they think Nigeria. Just tell us a little bit about operating in Cameroon, because I think I'm right in saying that Cameroon used to be a German territory. About 100 years ago, the French and the British said, we'll have various bits of that. And there's a sort of dual legal system. There's sort of British bits of legal system and French bits of legal system. But how do you find operating in the country?
Well, you're quite right. Originally, it was a German colony, and then it got divvied up between the French and the English, as so many things did. And then there was both a French Cameroon and an English Cameroon, and the English Cameroon, when independence came around, had the opportunity to join Nigeria, but chose not to. So Cameroon, as a nation, was founded on these two separate languages and legal systems and so forth, which were and still are operating in parallel. Now, you have a little bit of friction at the moment in Cameroon because the majority are French, and so day to day you encounter more French speakers. You tend to see contracts in French. You deal with a lot of things in French, which suits me fine. I paid attention at school, and
if you're like me, that would have done you no good at all.
But there is an English-speaking minority who feel that they've perhaps been neglected a bit in the last decade and are not so happy about that. Nevertheless, I have to say that it's a quite different situation from Nigeria, where you have Boko Haram type problems in the country, and also where in any case there's a long-standing history of problems with oil installations that have nothing to do with politics, but just have to do with straightforward theft. That doesn't seem to have happened in the same way in Cameroon. Cameroon's a country where the rule of law is very important, where people take every aspect of the petroleum code very seriously, both in terms of the ministry and the national oil company. And there's all the finest traditions of both the British and French civil services that seem to have been maintained. And that means that sometimes it takes a long time to get things done, just like it took us a long time to get the license agreed in the first place, because the due diligence they did on us as a potential operator was very substantial. But the plus side of that is that it's also a place where if you do things in the right way, then you get the support of the ministry, you'll get the support of SNH, and you don't have some of the problems that you have in some West African countries where there are blurry lines over what the rules really mean. So overall I found it a great place for us to work, and I think that even though it means that we have to anticipate the requirements of government and make sure that we keep our partners in government closely informed of what's happening and aligned with us, it also means that I think we can count on their support going forward, and they're very excited about what we're doing, just as we are.
All right, Jeremy, we're very short of time, but merci bien, as I think they say in your part of the world. Thank you very much indeed for joining us, and à la prochaine fois. Ladies and gentlemen, that was Jeremy Asher, the Chairman and Chief Executive of Tower Resources. Tower Resources, whose shares you could buy about a year ago for about half where they are now. So they were about 3/4 of a penny then, they're now trading at about a penny and a half. So 100% in the space of a year or thereabouts. So I'm afraid, as I say, that's all we've got time for. We'll be back very soon with more CEOs to interview. And until then, here's me, Charlie Gibson, signing off. And until then, you have a very capital day.